So let's delve into the best performing bourse. We've got Egypt, which has done really well year to date, up over 30%. Over the past week, a gain of almost 5%. The truth is, this is one of the most battered bourses on the African continent since the beginning of last year when we saw the revolution occurring.
That's true. And I mean, without a doubt, we've seen the numbers come through. It's been very strong performance each and every week coming into 2012. But we know the reasons for this. We are seeing some resolution to the political situation where they are going through the motions of setting up a new government in the new democratic setup that they actually have. And a lot of investors are excited about this. But also you'll find that valuations have been beaten down quite significantly. I mean, if you look at the index level now, we're probably about 65% below the levels we last saw in about 2008. And that's
so there's still a long way to go.
If certain things fall into place on the political front, I think the stocks will regain ground quite strongly.
With regards to, given the fact that we've actually seen quite a bit of positivity, it is off a low base, but not nearly as high as what we saw in 2008. The question is, for those investors that still want to get a piece of the pie, do you think that now is the time? Because it seems that resolution, as you mentioned, is occurring, and that is now the path that we are going to see occurring in Egypt. I doubt that they're going to digress from what they're looking at right now.
I think there's two things to consider. There are Egypt-specific factors which have been affecting performance, which is what we're talking about, the changes in the political situation. But you also have some global market issues which have been coming to play. For instance, to the end of last year, coming into this year, you've seen a return to risk. So a lot of people, or a lot of international investors, have been looking to pick up risk positions right across the world. And Egypt does show up in quite a number of international indices, and as such has benefited from that. That's one. The other thing is the fact that there's been a lot of event-driven performance that we've actually seen in some of the stocks. As you may well know, Orascom Telecom has been very active in the M&A front, and that has come back to bode well for the share price, which is up in excess of 100% in the year to
So
date.
it predominantly moved by the overall bourse, by the overall telecom sector. Is that the right prognosis to
Quite correct. Orascom Telecom and Mobilnil pushed performance quite strongly, but we did see some of the other stocks contribute to that rally as well.
Fungai, what about the overall construction sector? I know that that was also quite strong in Egypt. Are we starting to see a bit of a recovery? Because as things start to rectify, we will also see a lot of spending on infrastructure going forward.
Agreed, Eleni. I think there is some respite coming through for those stocks as well. You will see Suez Cement has come through with some fairly decent performance, as have many of the other cement and construction linked sort of businesses. Ultimately, however, these sort of businesses need for there to be stability, particularly for their operations that are in Egypt. You get the likes of Orascom Construction, however, which derives the bulk of its earnings from outside of Egypt, so different factors would drive that, but I think the broad theme is essentially the same.
So although Zambians are celebrating winning over Ivory Coast yesterday, worst performing bourse last week was down around 3%. So not a fantastic performance coming through from Zambia, but also dealing with its own set of macroeconomic issues. Copper prices are relatively, well, they're looking quite closer to $10,000 per ton, but there's a lot of things that are starting to affect the overall investor sentiment.
I think concerns about what is taking place in China with inflation, with their demand for commodities, that comes back to affect considerations about the copper price, which will directly impact thinking around the kwacha. We have also seen some stock-specific things actually driving this negative Zambian performance. We did see last week Zambeef come through with the announcement that they might have to pay an import duty liability, which dates back from 2008 to current, which has actually come up. It's about 54 billion kwacha, which is actually a very big number in their life if they have to pay that. So that did put people in, to get people to start thinking about negative things with regards to the business. And we also saw Zanaco coming through with an announcement that government wanted to reconsider the contract under which Rabobank had actually been given shareholding within the business. Now, we have seen these sort of reconsiderations before in Zambia, and I think the impact elsewhere has been particularly negative, and I think a lot of this shone through into the share prices.
Also windfall tax that could actually come through on copper as well, over above 10,000. But let's take a look at Zimbabwe. It was the second best performing market last week. It was up around 2.1%, but year to date, it's down almost 2%. The biggest issue that Zimbabwe faces is a liquidity squeeze, and they're starting to see quite a few reforms coming through when it comes to the stock exchange. Is this going to be enough to rectify the problem that we see with liquidity?
I think every reform they manage to push through is obviously a good thing, and that ultimately comes back to to help what actually happens with prices. The idea, however, is to engage as many buyers and sellers as possible to participate in the market. Some of the companies, however, have been coming through with very good news, or at least are expected to come through with very good news. So we saw the shining light on that index as InScore coming through with some very solid performance as people are looking forward to decent reporting coming from that company.
Let's touch on Ghana, because Ghana is third best performing bourse, and up 1.6% last week, but a gain of over 2.8% year to date. These kind of numbers, can we actually start to see significant returns for the Ghanaian market, because the macroeconomic environment there is one of the best on the African continent?
Quite agreed. I think there's two things to consider when one thinks about Ghana. One of the biggest issues with a lot of African exchanges at the moment is the stock exchange market caps do not necessarily reflect what is actually happening in the economy. This is because the key drivers of the economy tend to be unlisted businesses or industries that actually don't have stock exchange representation. So obviously changing this, especially in the case of Ghana, will actually show the strong economic performance start to shine through on the stock exchange as well. And obviously there's always the issue of liquidity. A lot of these stock markets still have low liquidity, but it is rising. We are getting many more participants on the market, and I think that will come back to help prices positively.